Good evening and welcome to New Money. I'm your host, Bryan Hirsch. Tonight's program, we're continuing last week's discussion on estate planning and expanding our focus to financial and tax planning. We'll be sharing valuable insights and guidance to help you make informed financial decisions. Joining me this evening are Harry Joffe, Head of Legal Services at Discovery Life, and Hardy Swart, Managing Director and Wealth Advisor of Family Wealth Custodians. Hardy, first time with on the show. Thanks for joining us. Harry, returning again after a great weekend. Liverpool, I can see your face. Liverpool had a good win. I had a lovely weekend supporting Man United and Kaizer Chiefs.
Right, let me just say, when Liverpool win the league in May, you will be wearing a Liverpool shirt at the other show.
Yeah.
That's my promise.
Okay, well, that's your promise. I'm making no promises. But anyway, Harry, last week, as we were going off the show, I touched on the story about SARS now wanting statement of assets and liabilities. And the question I'm asking you, how's that going to impact on taxpayers? And are taxpayers now going to have to produce evidence and information going back years of how these assets may have been accumulated?
Yeah, so Brian, I mean, as we said last week, it's not so clear. We haven't done this year's tax return yet, of course. So last year's, closed a few months ago, end of November, for most people, and now there's a provisionals. We didn't see in the last year's tax return that requirement that you had to submit a statement of assets and liabilities. Of course, if you're worth more than 50 million, then you will have to. If you're applying for an ART certificate, then you will have to. So we'll have to wait and see what comes in this year's tax return if it's across the board. I don't see it coming across the board, to be honest. But for all of us that have applied for the ART, and a lot of people have, you have to submit the assets and liability
Sorry,
statement.
Harry, just explain ART.
That's the old tax clearance certificate that you apply for if you want to take more than 1 million rand out the country.
It's your foreign allowance up to 10 million rand.
Correct. So there you have to submit an asset and liability statement for the last 3 years. I must be honest, we've never seen any issues with it. You know, it's normally a formality. Of course, if it's something very, very weird in your tax life, you know, you're earning 50,000 rand a month and you're applying for 10 million rand to take out, and then your asset and liability statements show very little assets, then of course they will go after you. But in the main, the asset and liability statement itself doesn't trigger anything major. As long as it ties up and as long as your affairs are in order, and you know, it's quite clear, you can show that you can afford to take out the 10 million rand or the 5 million, then there haven't been an issue. So it's really not an issue in itself, I would say.
Hardy, let's talk about the industry. You haven't been as long as I've been. This is my 60th year. You're talking maybe 20, 25 years ago. What's exciting you about this industry? Because it's not an easy industry. I mean, you know, one of our important objectives is to make money for our clients. And if you just look at January, firstly, looked like rates weren't going to come down. The markets came off. A week into January, markets, CPI came out, was much better. Then Trump, then NVIDIA, then DeepSeek, then the tariffs, all in 1 month. I've never seen anything like a yo-yo. And I keep saying to investors, listen, you can't watch the news of the day. You'll have sleepless nights. Become ostriches, put your head in the sand, and just let things happen over the period of time, like we've seen over the last number of years. But a difficult month. But is there anything that excites you in this industry any longer?
Yeah, no, Brian. It's like a bit of a circus at the moment. What excites me is I think the industry has evolved a lot. I mean, coming from a very sales-orientated sort of approach to where we are now, where I think it's much more professional. If I just look at the caliber of youngsters coming to the industry, highly qualified, honors degrees, master's degrees, even doctorate degrees. So I think that's one thing. And what excites me also is from a regulatory point of view, there's a much clearer emphasis on ethics and being professional. You know, so putting your client first, not only selling them some sort of product that they don't understand, but actually making sure that it's tailor-made to what they need. And then also the whole concept of holistic advice. I think there's a much bigger movement towards understanding your client's full scope of what their needs are. And this encapsulates things like retirement planning, estate planning, and all the other aspects of financial planning. And then technology. Technology really excites me because I think with the advent of technology and fintech, people are accessing financial planning tools much easier. So it's making it much more accessible for Joe Soap out there. And then the final thing that really excites me, Barry, is just that there's a much clearer movement towards consumer education. And I think a lot of South Africans want to understand why are they making certain decisions, how it impacts them in the long term. So that's the sort of things that excites me.
The difficulty is when people say, I've got some money I want to invest, and I say, don't ever invest money in isolation. How does it fit into your financial jungle? Where does it fit? Because, you know, people make decisions ad hoc. And I think that's what's changing. you have to look at the big picture. And Harry, when we talk about decisions, I mean, let's just talk about one of the aspects we also left out last week is about clients taking money offshore and converting it into a trust. And that's where you love to punt. I always give you this opportunity, Harry, and I can tell you I'm allowing you to punt on one condition: you don't make me wear a Liverpool shirt. But you allow me to punt. But Harry, moving assets offshore through your foreign exchange allowance and then putting it into a trust,
Right.
as compared to an endowment policy.
Sure. Just to say, you'd look so good in a nice white Liverpool shirt. I've already got one set up for you. But when we talk about a trust, you know, let's be honest, a trust offshore, I'm not talking about a local trust, but an offshore trust is a very elitist thing. You don't just take an offshore trust because you think you might need it. You know, you need to be worth it. You need to have enough assets offshore to justify it. As we said last week.
And Harry, just one thing about assets, not rand assets.
Of course, dollar assets.
Dollar or sterling assets, or whatever the currency you've chosen. And, you know, a million rand here is £1 million, £1 million is $1 million. People don't always realize that it's the quantum in that foreign currency.
And what people forget, you know, with a local trust, it's become a lot more expensive in recent times because of all the compliance. Okay, but it's still, you can get a local trust set up for about 10,000 rand, and you can pay probably 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 rand a year to manage it if it's a simple trust. Offshore, you're going to be paying at least $7,000, $8,000 a year, at least, for an offshore trust. And then any planning around that, any consultations with your trustees are going to be a lot more. You'll be paying in dollars, probably $1,500 an hour, something like that. So these offshore trusts are very, very expensive vehicles. So if you've got $1 or $2 million, to be honest, it's just not worth your while. And I'll be honest as well, the offshore trust companies aren't interested in you at $1 or $2 million. It's not worth their while on the kind of fees they can charge. So you're probably looking at a minimum, Bryan, I would say $5 million plus before you even think of an offshore trust. Much simpler, and this is exactly what we spoke about last time. If you're an average middle-class South African, you know, you might have $500,000 you want to get offshore, $1 million. Rather go into an offshore endowment wrapper. All the insurance companies offer them. Of course, I will punt Discoveries, but all the offshore all the big insurers offer them. Sanlam, Mutual, Momentum, Liberty, they will offer them. And what happens is you go into this offshore wrapper. They all are issued in an offshore tax center. You know, we use Guernsey. Sanlam uses Bermuda, Old Mutual uses Isle of Man. They're all in these offshore tax centers. So you don't have any Citus tax issues, as we've discussed. Your tax, you still pay tax inside the fund. It's at a much lower rate than you would pay personally, particularly on the capital gains tax side. The compliance is simpler. And most importantly, two important issues. After 3 years, in terms of the South African Long-Term Insurance Act, Section 63, that policy, if it's got a life assured on, is protected against insolvency, which means it's almost as good as being in a trust after 3 years. And secondly, and very importantly, you nominate beneficiaries on those policies. You can have a beneficiary for ownership or for proceeds or for both, which means when you pass away, it passes to the next generation. So for all intents and purposes, it's a cheap man's trust. It's giving you a lot of the benefits of a trust. Of course, not all. It's not out of your estate. But a lot of the other benefits of a trust is giving you at a much, much cheaper rate. You know, your funds and your fees are very transparent on these offshore endowments. You're paying platform fees, of course. But that's it. You're not paying a trust administration fee. And Bryan, just to finish, I must tell you, we've had so many clients recently who've come to us and said, I've got $2 million in a trust offshore, or $2.5 million. It's just not worth my while. They'll close the trust and they move into one of our offshore endowment wrappers. Now, closing a trust in itself could have tax consequences. I'm not saying you must always do that, but that's where we are at the moment.
So I'm going to deal with Harry with another, particularly customary marriages, but I want to just talk about the different marriage regimes and how you deal with that differently in your approach to providing clients with advice.
Yeah, Bryan, so I think it's super important, especially when it comes to being married in community of property, because you can't plan for just the one spouse. You need to plan for both, because what's mine is yours and yours is mine, so it's sort of all encapsulated in one. So it's very important is when you start planning is to have both spouses planning it, present and to plan for their unique circumstances as a couple. When if it's out of community without accrual, then you can plan for the individual, because basically there's what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours. But then when there's out of community with the accrual claim, then of course when there's things like a divorce or when it comes to estate planning, you have to take the accrual claim into calculation, because that can have a significant impact on the outcome, on the long-term outcome of the individual. So yeah.
Harry, I don't think a lot of people, particularly with accrual, take into account sometimes that estate planning, particularly where money is not left to spouses.
Yeah, I mean, Bryan, obviously if you're leaving everything to the surviving spouse, it comes out in the wash because they're getting everything anyway. But if that spouse is not the sole heir or not the main heir, then that accrual claim is a very important issue to think about, and it needs to be funded for. So, I mean, between me and Harder in the industry, we often say to a client, you need to have a life insurance policy to create the cash to pay your spouse for that accrual claim. Because, again, that spouse can't just forgo that accrual claim, and they often won't. Why would they if they're not the sole heir? We had an interesting debate a while ago. We had this director of a major listed company. He was worth over 600 million rand, and he was married out of community property with accrual, and he hadn't thought about the accrual claim. And when he died, he hadn't died yet, but if he were to die, his spouse would be about a 100 million rand claim against his estate as part of the accrual claim. And we said to him, how are you going to fund that? And he said to her, well, just give it up, just forgo your right. But now that could create tax consequences to her, because she could be making a donation by foregoing that right, because she's no longer a spouse when he dies, so she doesn't get that spousal exemption. And these things are going to be very tricky. You've got to fund for that somehow, and you've got to plan for that.
So that, I mean, so many people don't realize that, particularly with, as you say, with accrual.
Yeah, I mean, if they're leaving everything to each other, then it's neat and tidy, but they often aren't. You're leaving assets to the kids, and then she could have a claim. Or the other way around. I mean, of course, it's the other way around. He could also have or she could die first, and there could be a claim that way, just by her dying first. So it's interesting, Bryan, some of the new antenuptial contracts that I'm reading, when they go into this accrual marriage, they actually put something in there about the accrual, because the biggest worry is, okay, if he dies first, his estate hopefully has got enough money and enough life policies to pay that liquidity need. But what they don't think about, if she dies first, because if she dies first, the marriage is over, the accrual claim kicks in, now he's alive, so his policies haven't paid out. How's he going to afford the 100 million plus to pay her estate, because she's died first? So in the new antenuptial contracts I'm seeing now, they actually have a clause in there to say, the accrual applies normal if the richer spouse dies first. If the poorer spouse dies first, then there won't be an accrual claim. And they actually put that in the antenuptial contract, which is quite interesting, because if you think about it, if she dies first, why does she actually need the accrual claim? Obviously, if he dies first, she's going to be looked after if she's poorer. But if she dies first, her estate doesn't really need the accrual claim, assuming they marry. I mean, they would be married.
Well, unless she's left assets, it's a second marriage, and she left assets to children from her first marriage.
Yeah, but Bryan, you'll find most second marriages don't have any accrual at all, because it's normally at a later stage in life. They're normally well established, and they don't need each other's accrual. So it's normally a first marriage issue.
Okay, well,
clients need to think about it.
Let's pick this up after the break. We're going to take a short break. You're watching You and Your Money this evening. Stay tuned. We'll be back shortly.